Hello, my name is Lynn Brown, and let me officially welcome you all to the 2020 Inside American Politics Conference. Now, in previous years, we have had the distinct pleasure of holding this conference jointly with each other and in very inspiring cities like Florence and Athens. That, of course, is not our situation today, but the platform may be virtual, but the topic couldn't be more real and consequential. I don't know, do you think the election was exciting enough the last few weeks and days to get your analytical adrenaline all going? I certainly hope so. Seriously, of all the times we have hosted this conference over the years, this has got to be one of the more fraught election cycles in our lifetime. Certainly a roller coaster counting process, and still unclear a full clarifying picture of what is happening down ballot for several weeks. So we have assembled a stellar team to help us navigate a couple of key questions. What happened and why? Was there an expected gap between expectations and eventual results? And if so, what was the cause of that? And how are the two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, now going to move forward in terms of either both their program and their policies, but also how they position themselves electorally over the next couple of years? So with that, let me turn the mic over to my co-conspirator in this endeavor, Ellen Toscano. Ellen?
Hello, my name is Ellen Toscano. I'm the co-founder of the Inside American Politics series, hosted for 10 years by La Pietra Dialogues in Florence, and last year and this year by the Bradamus Center at NYU. We started the annual conference in 2008, following the historic election of Barack Obama as president of the United States. Now we come together to discuss the election of Joe Biden with an equally historic vice president, Kamala Harris, the first woman of color. We do find ourselves in a transitional and dynamic moment in the transfer of power from the current president, Donald Trump, who has not conceded, but instead will contest the results of the election in the courts, to President-elect Biden, widely accepted and acknowledged as the president-elect, based upon the counts of state and local voting officials across the country. However contested, there was a historic turnout, with votes still being counted. The turnout hit a 50-year high at 148 million votes, which accounts for 62% of the eligible voting age population in the United States. We are very grateful to the participants in these panels over the next 2 days. Each of our panelists is expert and experienced in American politics and very busy with the ongoing drama of this historic and historically messy transfer of power. Before we begin, let me thank my co-organizer, Steve McMahon, with whom I have had the true pleasure of working all these years in the presentation of these conferences, and the Bradamus Center, Executive Director Lynn Brown, who you just heard from, and Deputy Director of Programming and Outreach, Tom McIntyre. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors in programming, Federal Hall, with its own series entitled Debate Defends Democracy, the Brennan Center for Justice, and NYU Votes. Some logistical notes. We will leave time at the end of each panel, hopefully the last 15 minutes, for questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A box. We will not read bios in the interest of making more time for the panels. They are on the website of NYU DC, and a link is in the chat. So with that, I will introduce the moderator of the first panel, Steve McMahon, longtime Democratic strategist and co-founder of Purple Strategies, LLC. Steve.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Lynn, and thanks to NYU for doing this. We've got a great panel today, people who have worked in politics on both the Democratic side and the Republican side, people who are journalists, and then others who have been television producers, and in the case of Betsy, who's now the executive director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University. And so we're excited to have this conversation today, and we're talking in this first panel about what just happened in the election, and we're going to dig deep into it. But Jonathan Martin, who is one of our journalist panelists today, wrote a great piece in the New York Times just the other day, a couple days ago, looked at how Joe Biden won, what the kind of key moments were. And so maybe a good way to start this off would be to go to Jonathan and to just give us a quick summary of how you think Biden won this thing. What were the pivotal moments, and how did the Biden campaign take advantage of those?
Well, Steve, thanks, and thanks, guys, for doing this again, even though this is a very different environment than we're used to across the pond, but we'll make the best of 2020 with an eye on 2021 being better. I think the wisdom of the Democrats nominating Joe Biden has come into focus the last week, right? This was a personal repudiation of Donald Trump's conduct. This was not a political statement on the Republican Party. And look no further than the difference between the Republicans who were expected to lose 8 to 10 seats in the House, and instead they're probably going to gain as many seats, while President Trump loses, pretty convincingly. Biden's on track to win about 306 electoral votes. So I think this was a split decision between a country that was fatigued by the conduct of the president, that wanted somebody who was going to, bring some measure of political normalcy back to America, but at the same time they weren't calling for a sort of expansive, progressive government. And so we're now in a place where the Democratic majority in the House has been reduced significantly. The Senate will probably be about 50-50 or 51-49 Republican, depending upon what happens in Georgia in January. The question now is, was Joe Biden the only Democrat that could have beaten Donald Trump? I mean, given how close the race was in some of those swing states, would a different Democrat have been able to put together that coalition of keeping the party's base of racial minorities in big cities, growing the Hillary advantage in the suburbs, and doing a little better or about the same as her in the rural areas? Could anybody else besides Biden have done that? Obviously, we'll never know the answer, but Biden did do it. I think that's credit to him and to his party for nominating him. Real fast on your question, how did he do it? By being Joe Biden, a consensus-oriented, kind of center-left Democrat who instinct was to try to heal the country, to try and cool divisions instead of inflaming them. And he caught hell for it last year in the primary. On every debate night, they were coming after him and said that he was naive. How could you think you could work with the Republicans these days? But he never wavered from that message. And you guys know this who work in campaigns. The campaigns that win have message consistency. And if you look at his opening video in April of 2019 and take it through the speech he gave on Saturday night claiming victory, you will see a through line of Joe Biden running on restoring the soul of America. America is better than Donald Trump. And I am going to restore us to a more, congenial, sort of less polarized place. And obviously it worked. Along the way, were there some challenges? Sure. But I think that consistency was essential, Steve. And the last point that I'll make is this. There is an argument to be made, and I can make it because I wrote the story in March, that effectively this election came to an end the second week in March because two things happened that week. First, Biden effectively ended the primary by beating Bernie Sanders soundly in Michigan on Tuesday, March 10th, which was the week after Super Tuesday. The next day is where we all got really hit in the head by COVID It was clear that next day, Wednesday, that COVID was real. The president gave a speech that night in the Oval Office. Tom Hanks was diagnosed with having COVID, and the NBA canceled the rest of its season. I think that week in March was really the turning point, because it became clear that the whole Trump theory of the case, which was maybe you don't like me, but the economy is doing great and the other guys are crazy, that triple-pronged theory of the case came crashing down, because the Democrats didn't nominate Bernie Sanders, they nominated Joe Biden, and he wasn't going to be able to run on the economy anymore, obviously, because the pandemic crashed the economy. So I think you can really trace the election back to that second week of March. With that,
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. And I want to call on Todd now, because Todd is one of the best Republican strategists out there and actually represented a number of candidates who outperformed Donald Trump and won their election. I remember, Todd, when we were talking after the election, at some point you said you weren't sure that your candidates could actually outperform Donald Trump and win. It looked like they might have been tied together, but that's exactly what happened. They outperformed Donald Trump and won. What did you see? And do you think Jonathan's analysis is right, that it was over in March? Or do you think it was, I mean, you know, given the result and how close it was, it seems like it was never really over until the ballots were counted. But what do you think?
It didn't feel like it was over in March. I think Jonathan was exactly right in calling this. In fact, I'd made a note of it myself. This was a split decision election. We've talked for ages about Trump's problems in the suburbs. The problem Republicans had in 2018 was that there was no way for suburban voters to express their disapproval of Donald Trump specifically. And so they voted against Republicans generally as a way to show their disapproval. This time around, they could vote against Trump. And so you have in all kinds of swing districts and in swing statewide races, you have all of these suburban voters who didn't like Trump personally, although they did like a lot of his economic policies. But at the same time, they were not ready to embrace, although it may not have been Biden's agenda, there was a sense among a lot of suburban voters that the kinds of cultural changes that the left have been talking about were an anathema to them. And one of the things I think that Republicans did a particularly good job in terms of messaging on this cycle was keeping that conversation alive about the cancel culture and defunding the police and the riots and all of that. And so what you ended up with was a situation where in 2020, voters could go and vote against Trump, but in state after state and race after race, they could then turn around and vote Republican, whether it's in, well, look at Maine for starters, but the Minnesota House, the state legislature there, in Wisconsin, in my firm, we did the race in Pennsylvania 1, Brian Fitzpatrick's race, one of the, swingiest of all swing districts. And I think Brian's going to end up outperforming, we don't have the final data, but I think he's going to outperform the president by like 14 or 15 points. Don Bacon in Nebraska too, same sort of dynamic. The final point I'll make on that is that one of the reasons why that dynamic worked both for Biden and for down ballot Republican candidates is because the Biden campaign did a really good job of keeping the choice. Every election is about a choice. The most famous one from 1984, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? The Biden campaign did a really good job of making sure that the choice that voters were thinking about was an up or down vote on Donald Trump. This was a referendum on Donald Trump. It was not a binary choice between two candidates. And that allowed, and compare that to like 2016, where you truly did have a choice, that the entire last 10 days of the race, were all about Hillary Clinton. This, from January onward of this year, the entire thing has been about Donald Trump and an up or down vote.
So in that up or down vote, one of the things as a Democrat I'm extremely excited about, in addition to Joe Biden, is the history making that occurred with Kamala Harris. And I want to talk a little bit about a couple of really important subgroups in the Democratic Party constituency, women and minority voters. And I want to go to Joel, the pollster. Before we talk about the polls, Joel, let's just talk about some of the voters that made this possible. Joel and Doug in particular, I'd like you guys, if you could, to comment. Joel is a Democratic pollster, one of the best and finest there is anywhere in the world. And Doug Thornell was involved in many, many races as a partner at SKDK, which was heavily involved in the Biden campaign, but Doug runs their political operation and did many, many congressional and Senate races as well. So I'd like to get from the two of you, if I could, a little bit on the turnout and which demographic groups made the biggest impact and what that portends for both the Democratic Party and the Republican parties going forward. Doug, would you mind starting?
Sure. And it's great to be a part of this group. Again, it's always fun to break down the election with so many smart folks. So appreciate you guys having me again. And I agree with almost everything that folks have said so far. Look, I think that a lot of the gains that we saw in 2018 that the Democratic Party made in the suburbs, and actually started with Hillary Clinton in 16, but then certainly increased in 18. I think we've seen that Biden was able to build on those gains in the suburbs in 2020. Secondly, I think when you look at turnout, numbers are still coming in, but when you look at places like Milwaukee and Philadelphia, and when you're looking at Detroit and Flint, we're seeing that the numbers of Black voters definitely increased. There's some question about sort of the percentage of those that went for Trump, but the overall number in many of those places have increased. And that was in part due to an emphasis by the Biden campaign early on to reaching those and connecting to those voters. We also saw it among Asian American voters as well, and outside groups. I worked closely with the NAACP on turning out Black voters, and they had a concentrated effort on on Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia. They spent early, they spent in June, mobilizing volunteers, then transitioned that program to communicate through an actual persuasion program for Black voters, and then a turnout program, infrequent voters. And that started in the end of September. So, look, I think that, there are, those are, some, particularly in the suburbs, a place where Democrats, Biden in particular, needs to feel good about the campaign he ran. I think that we can have a conversation about polls being off and polls being whatever, but I think the strategy of the Biden campaign should be really looked at and applauded in the sense that they had a strategy to focus on those three states. They did advertise other places, but their core states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And now when you look at Arizona, those were four components of the Biden campaign. I mean, look at where Biden was the last 24, 48 hours of the campaign. He was in Pennsylvania, and there were polls that showed Democrats up pretty soundly in Pennsylvania, but the Biden campaign wasn't taking anything for granted. They were in Pennsylvania. They were all over Pennsylvania, and that made a huge difference. So while there may have been indications from other polls that there were other states in play, I think one of the things there are many things I think I would give credit to the Biden campaign, but they didn't get distracted by shiny objects. Yes, they did invest in certain, like Texas and in Ohio, but the overall strategy of their focus on those three blue states that was critical to Biden winning remained from the start. And they also knew that they needed another one just in case, one of the blue states didn't work out. And so they had, they focused on Arizona, and they also had a focus on Georgia. So, there's a lot to unpack overall, but I think that, the message discipline that Jonathan mentioned was right on. But, look, I also think that, one of the biggest strategic errors that I think by the Trump campaign mail was undermining vote by mail. That they made was undermining vote by mail. And we ran the Biden campaign ran a major vote by mail campaign. And it made a huge difference. And, there was a time when Republicans used to vote by mail a lot, or at least have confidence in it, and absentee balloting. And, that's why Florida in many ways runs such a sophisticated system where they get results, is that they have older voters, and and voting by mail is not something that is not something that is strange to them. So that was a big tactical mistake by the Trump campaign, and one that Biden took advantage of, and potentially may give him is the reason why he won the presidency, along with a number of other things.
So Joel, looking at Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, how does it look different to you in since 2016?
Well, I think let me take that, but first say, overall, I often say to people, we forget we're a 50-50 country, and we're probably not really 50-50. We're really 40-40, with about 20% who consider themselves both moderate and independent at the same time. And so to win elections in this country, you have to win the middle. And that's particularly true when you look at those three states up in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. On a national level, Joe Biden improved his performance over Hillary Clinton with independent voters by 12 points. From 42 to 54, and similarly among moderate voters, self-identified moderate voters, which Hillary got 52% of, Biden got 64%. I think that when you look at those three states, those were the blue wall. You have to win those three states if you're a Democrat. As I said a couple of years ago on this panel, it was a monumental blunder by the Clinton campaign. Brain trust that thought we had those states locked up, and she didn't campaign in those states. But you have to win the middle. And in this election in particular, even though Joe Biden is not from the left wing of the Democratic Party, Donald Trump is so far to the right in a way in his extreme behavior. He's not ideological, but in his behavior, he acts in a way that is very alienating to those voters in the middle. And I think I've been talking about suburban voters early on. He plummeted in the early days of the coronavirus, in the aftermath of George Floyd. Donald Trump plummeted with suburban voters, falling behind with a group he had won by 4 points. And they make up half the electorate generally in presidential elections. But he had plummeted in most polls, including Fox News, which I think is the best media polling out there. He was down at some point 16 or 18 points with those suburban voters. Now, the margin wasn't anywhere near that big on election day, but if you look at the gains Biden made with suburban voters across the country, they make up about half the margin of victory for him. He's going to win this by about 3 to 3.5 points in the popular vote, and half that margin is coming from the suburbs. I think to Todd's point about a lot of really smart Republican campaigns out there, I agree with that totally. But I would also say that, when I say we're a 50-50 country, Americans don't love it when one party has all three branches of government. And I think if the system, is supposedly built on checks and balances, I think the voters often make sure that those checks and balances are there. And I think that's a lot of what happened. And I also think in terms of the congressional seats, and the Senate probably goes hand in hand on this one, 2018 was a big wave for Democrats. They picked up a huge number of seats. And I think this was, again, a check on it, a governor, if you will, as and you have speed control in a car, to make sure that this doesn't run away too much in one direction. So I think those dynamics were at play. I mean, we're probably going to talk a lot more about this being a referendum on the president. Any campaign where an incumbent's running for re-election, it's a referendum on the president's performance. And there is a predisposition towards incumbents. Over the course of history, we've had few landslides, only 7 presidents, Barack Obama being the 7th, to be elected and re-elected with more than 50% of the vote both times. We have a history going back to 1900. I think only before Trump, only 7 presidents who sought re-election, incumbents out of 19. I'm sorry, I think about 5 out of 19 lost their reelections. So there are a lot of dynamics here structurally that could have been in play for Trump, but more importantly, with the events that we had, the pandemic, the economy, which is Trump's strength, falling apart on him. You have more households with somebody out of work now than any time since the Great Depression, and he's out there every day saying, I built the greatest economy in history." It was tone deaf and out of touch.
Yeah. So I want to take a peek underneath the hood for a second on female voters. Betsy, you're the executive director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University, and of course, before that, you were the executive producer of Meet the Press all those years. So you know politics, you know subgroups, you know voters. You've watched this closely. How would you characterize both the turnout and the performance of female voters in the suburbs and elsewhere? And in particular, what role do you think they had in Georgia? We know anybody who's done Democratic politics knows that the most reliably dependable Democratic voters are African American or Black women, and women in general usually make up a majority of any electorate. So can you talk to us a little bit about the role of women in turnout and what you saw out there?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be with you guys. So yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, women are the most steadfast of voters, right? Outnumbering men in both voter registration and voter turnout. And that certainly held true this election cycle with women making up about 55% of the electorate looking at the exit polls. But, there was a lot of discussion earlier this year, not only about the blue wave, right, but about the female tsunami of blue wave, right, that was coming in to the Biden column, because we saw these pre-election polls showing Biden up between 15 to 26 points nationally among women. And I know we'll do the post-mortem on polls in another panel, but just for comparison's sake, in 2016, Hillary Clinton won women by about 13 points. So all the pre-election polls were showing it much higher than that. And what we ended up seeing from these preliminary exit polls, which the big caveat being it's early and there's an AP poll and an Edison poll, and trying to make sense of it all is not completely scientific at this point. But Biden, winning women by like 11 or 13 points. So really either staying the same as 2016 or perhaps shrinking slightly. But interestingly, in terms of gender, the movement into Biden's column and away from Trump really came from the male vote, which Trump won by 11 points in 2016, and polls showing now that him getting that male vote, by winning that male vote by a much smaller margin. So, and as you mentioned in the setup to the question, when we kind of look one step further into the women's vote and we examine race, of course, we know certainly that Black women in particular supported Biden at the highest rates. And Trump, again, appeared to win among white women, maybe even doing better than he did in 2016. But, the Black women definitely coming into play in terms of organization and support in some of those key urban areas. You mentioned Georgia. We certainly saw that in Philadelphia in terms of being able to organize, get the vote, and be sort of those reliable voters. And I think, as we also, mentioned Kamala Harris earlier too, I think that was significant in terms of motivating Black women to turn out. And, we certainly saw over the last couple of days with, celebrations about, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris giving her speech, showing up in suffrage white, little girls watching that, Black women, excited and proud. And I think that was a real special moment we saw.
Todd, I want to go back to Georgia for a second, if I can. You were involved in the Senate race there. So you were obviously paying attention to polling on a maybe a daily, but certainly a weekly basis. And you were seeing how these things were moving. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were seeing? And I don't know, Doug, if you were involved in Georgia at the same time looking at polling from the other side, but to the extent that you were aware of polling, Doug, if you could kind of tell us what you were seeing, because we occasionally get these moments like at the NYU conferences to compare notes where here's what the Republicans were seeing and here's what the Democrats were seeing in the same place at the same time. So let's just see if it lines up. Todd?
So I think it is an open question because we just don't have the data yet to definitively say in Georgia is ultimately the reason why Biden, who's going to carry the state, they haven't called it yet, but it is the reason Biden carried Georgia. Is it because of a massive increase in African-American turnout, or is it more to do with the dynamic that I was talking about before, that a few others have mentioned, that where the suburbs turning against Trump? Because while it is true that there were massive mobilizations of African-American voters, particularly in and around Atlanta, there were equally massive mobilizations of rural white voters. And there's some suggestion, again, we don't have all the data yet, but there's some suggestion that those two things likely canceled each other out by and large. And if that's the case, then the reason why Biden won is because of the suburban vote. And all you have to do is look, I have the data right here. As of yesterday, I think it was, Trump in the Atlanta suburbs, Trump is underperforming Purdue by almost a point and a half, and underperforming Purdue in the exurbs by a little north of half a point. When you just look at the raw numbers, Hillary narrowly won Cobb County, which Cobb County is about 25% African-American, 60 some odd percent white, middle to upper class. Hillary Clinton narrowly won Cobb in 16. Biden pretty overwhelmingly won Cobb County. And so I think the story for exactly what happened is yet to be written. And it could be that it's both, a combination of a massive African-American turnout and Trump losing support in the suburbs. But at the same time, I know everyone pays a lot of attention to Georgia, and people talk about like, oh, it's so close, it's so close. It's been heading this way for a long time. I was involved 2 years ago in Brian Kemp's governor's race, which, was probably the most competitive governor's race in the country. So this is not anything new, and the challenge for Republicans is going to be that it's probably only going to continue trending this way.
So I'd like to hear from Doug, and then Jonathan. I know the Times did a big story on Georgia recently, and obviously Joel, you've looked at the exits. So if you have anything you want to toss in there too, but Doug, can you tell us what you and the campaigns you were involved in were seeing at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, so if you start in 2018, there was I think we saw you could even go back to 2016, but we have seen incremental growth in terms of Democrats picking up voters in Georgia since 2016. 2018, we had a couple of really important congressional wins. We had a very close gubernatorial loss there, but close nonetheless. And then there was a lot of effort post that election by people like Stacey Abrams to grow the Democratic base, their registered voters. And I think as we saw, over the last couple months, I think that was a state that became increasingly one of those states that, unlike Ohio, which I never thought was ever a place we could win this cycle, given the makeup and the demographic of that state, it looked like a place that Democrats could do exceptionally well. And the numbers I was seeing sort of showed that. For one of the projects I was working on, we made a big investment towards the end, the last couple of weeks on a digital program to communicate directly with those 18 to 39-year-old Black voters, many of them infrequent Black voters, to get them to turn out. And while the numbers are still going in, I mean, I think to Todd's point, you actually probably could have two things be true: that Biden did well in the suburbs, but he also did exceptionally well with turning out Black voters. And so, you know, I mean, I think Georgia became one of those places like Arizona that became a lot more, I was more bullish on those two than I was ever on Florida, or for that matter, you know, Iowa or Ohio, just because of the makeups of the state. I mean, you know, and what we were seeing trend wise. And, you know, the campaigns made a strategic, I think they made a, you know, I think their decisions to invest there, you know, the work that they did to mobilize there made a huge difference. And a lot of the outside groups who played there made a huge difference.
Joel?
Yeah. You know, Georgia's a state I've been looking at for a while. And in fact, in 2012, 2016 in Hillary's campaign, at one point, people were feeling so bullish, they wanted to do a head fake and put some money in a red state to try to get the Republicans to invest there, and they chose Arizona. I argued against Arizona and argued for Georgia. I said no one in the press, people like Jonathan Martin, aren't going to believe that Arizona was competitive in 2016. Georgia was a much more credible state at that point.
Yeah.
So I think the Biden campaign made a right choice in playing there. The other factor is, in between the last election and this one, for a client, we did some analysis of population trends in the country. And post-financial crisis, for the first time since Reconstruction, African Americans were moving more from north to south than south to north.
Yeah.
And so those were states like North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, obviously Virginia, if you call it one of the below Mason-Dixon line states.
Yeah.
What behavioral economists say is the reason for that is during hard economic times, people move to where they know people, family and friends, who are more likely to connect them to jobs and to a social network. And so to me, Georgia was a state that, you know, wasn't going to turn blue for sure, but was going to be very competitive in this election. And I think the Biden campaign definitely played the right hand by investing there. Turns out Arizona was a pretty good investment this time as well. But those population trends mattered a lot. And the gains in population in Georgia have been not only of people of color, but also of millennials, people 18 to 34. So there are things happening in the demographics of the state that are going to make it probably a little more competitive going forward over time.
Jonathan, if you have anything you wanted to add, otherwise I'm going to go to your wife, Betsy.
I spent time in Georgia and Arizona in the last couple of months of the campaign. It was clear that both were going to be competitive. It was clear that Biden was smart to make an investment of time and money in both. What is striking is because of the COVID campaign, he only got to Phoenix once the entire campaign. Do you guys realize that Biden, and by the way, this is detailed in, I think, which story is this in? This is in the story that hopefully you guys all have in your Sunday paper, the lead all. Do you guys realize, you would if you read the story, that Biden only went west of the central time zone once the entire campaign? He went once to Vegas and Phoenix in September. Besides that, he never left central time. It's extraordinary. But he did get out there. He was in Warm Springs and Atlanta the final week of the campaign. The numbers were there. You had a combination of non-white voters and suburbanites who didn't like Trump's conduct, and it was a math thing, and it made a lot of sense. What's striking to me, guys, is that we kind of knew Arizona and Georgia were coming. What I'm curious about is why North Carolina just cannot get there for Democrats. It's such a hard state for Democrats to win. You know, they elect Democratic governors there every 4 years. And if Cooper serves his full 4-year term as governor, they will have had Democratic governors for 28 of 32 years in North Carolina. They've elected one Democratic senator in this century, and that was in 2008, the year that Obama carried that state. So Democrats have a problem in North Carolina with federal elections. They cannot win Senate races there. They have a hard time winning the presidency there, even though the demographics seem to be about as good as Georgia. I think part of the difference is probably there's less of a black vote in Carolina than there is in Georgia. It's about 20% of the population.
Jonathan?
I don't know where he went.
He's thinking.
Well, you
his
know what? He's
laptop
probably
died.
still talking.
His laptop
Can you
died,
hear
I'm
him in the
told.
other room?
His laptop
Um,
is dead.
So, oh, okay. So we'll let him come back when he's back. But Betsy, if you could for a second, one of the interesting things that I've always thought was a high wire act for GOP candidates who are women is kind of separating themselves from what I would call the misogyny of Donald Trump, and being able to run sort of an independent persona and win as Republicans. Can you give us a little perspective on that?
Yeah, and Todd mentioned this point earlier that we did see some support coming down in these down ballot races towards Republicans and improving their numbers, of course, in the House and in the Senate. And the effect of that essentially is that now we have even more women, Republican women, that have been elected to Congress. And when you run an institute on women in politics, that's a good thing because there's no way to get to sort of that parity in congressional representation unless you have both parties bringing women into the process. And so now we are sort of on track to have even more women in Congress. I think the number right now, which is a record number, is 127. And with a couple races left to be decided, it's already up to 132. So not a huge difference, but moving in the right trajectory. Still under a quarter total in the House.
I'm back.
He's back.
Jonathan,
well,
welcome back.
Now.
Don't
miss
interrupt
Florence.
your wife, Jonathan.
Yeah.
I miss Florence.
Wait your turn now. But the Republicans, smartly, after 2018, when we saw only one new Republican woman elected to Congress and 35 Democratic women, they really just put a lot of focus, money, and resources and effort into recruiting some good Republican women candidates and having those women in place to take advantage of the electoral wins that were moving their way this election cycle. And so you do see 13 new Republican women, some races still yet to be decided, but also coming at the expense, frankly, of some Democratic women incumbents who were beat. 5 of them. So, we'll have more women than ever in Congress, but still a way to go.
So, Jonathan, you were in the middle of a very compelling point when you
It wasn't that
suddenly
compelling.
froze.
I mean, the point that I was making was like, these states are fascinating to me. Like, why was Georgia ripe enough? Why was Arizona ripe enough? Both at the margins. But like North Carolina, a state that, you would think would be as favorable, just doesn't get there for Democrats. And I think we really got to drill down on some of these county by county votes. I mean, I just looking at North Carolina, Biden did better than not just Hillary, but Biden did better than Obama 2012 in some of the big metro areas. But why isn't he, coming closer to winning? And I think the answer is Trump has got a hold on rural voters that not only is intense, but it's also drawing more turnout too. I think Trump's turnout with his base is what really kept this election in those kind of states closer, because he's giving up ground in the metros, but he's making up for in a lot of these rural areas. Again, not just on the margins, but in terms of the depth of the turnout too. That's all I'm saying. Okay,
I'm going to go to Todd and then Doug. Okay.
So just to Jonathan's point, I was thinking a lot about this on the day after the election. I was in Iowa for election day and I was flying home, and at the time it looked very much like Trump might be reelected, and I was thinking about the hold that he has, the connection that he has to a big chunk of the Republican base, specifically white working class voters. And it reminded me of something that I hadn't thought of in a very, very, very long time, which I'm surprised I remembered at all, from a college economics class, but it's something called loss aversion theory. And what loss aversion theory says is that people are more motivated to protect what they already have than to get something new. And there have been all kinds of studies about this. They can even drill it down to like by a factor of, I think it's like 3 or 4 times more likely to want to protect what you already have. And so rightly or wrongly, and people can have a debate about this, but if you are a white working class voter, in many ways, your vote for Trump is to protect those things that you feel that you already have, to protect the kind of country that you grew up in, to protect the kind of culture that that you have always known and loved. And more, a lot of these people feel that is slipping away from them, whether it's immigration or the idea of sort of political correctness, or just the mere fact that whites will not be, we will be a majority non-white country, in the coming years. There are all kinds of reasons why people are worried that that they're going to lose that, and Trump speaks to that in a way that really no other candidate, certainly in my lifetime, has. And so the connection that they have with him it's not based on economics. It's not even based on politics. It's cultural, and and it's very, very powerful.
Okay, so I'm going to go to Doug, and then Joel, and then I want to come back to this intensity thing, Todd, that you mentioned, because it's a whole nother topic for us. Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, one thing that I want to point that I wanted to raise, the Democrats had to run their campaigns much differently than they had in the past. In the past, Democrats were very, they relied on voter contact methods like going door to door and doing rallies to help with both voter registration and for turnout. And for most campaigns in the Democratic side, that we weren't doing that. We weren't doing a lot of direct voter contact in terms of going door to door. It definitely increased towards the end. And we weren't doing the rallies that I think Democrats have become accustomed to. And a lot of the things like souls to the polls and a lot of the organizing with churches and turning folks, that was something that Democrats chose to not do as much because of, obviously the pandemic. I think Trump and many Republicans took a different approach. And I just wonder, at this race at the presidential level, likely from a popular vote standpoint, likely won't be that close. Obviously, it's closer electoral from a electoral vote standpoint in the House and Senate races. But I think when you look at some of these places, did that make a difference? Like the fact that Democrats didn't do a lot of those traditional voter contact methods that we're used to, that Democratic voters are used to. Yes, we did phoning. Yes, we did virtual calls, but we weren't doing as much door to door. And that makes a huge difference. It's a lot more effective than doing phones, than SMS texting. Having face-to-face conversations makes a huge difference. And I just wonder if this was in a non-COVID era, if we were doing that, whether some of the numbers would have been actually even been better for Dems.
Joel?
Yeah, I want to go back to something Todd said, and I don't disagree with most of what he said, and I also agree wholly on the loss aversion theory, which I've read about as well. But one thing that's interesting, and look, Trump is his own worst enemy. We all know that. It's unfathomable to me that their campaign didn't know that 60% of voters would have said that their economic situation today was the same or worse than it was 4 years ago. Keep talking about building the biggest economy on earth when 60%, the greatest economy in history, when 6 out of 10 voters don't feel that way, is bad politics. It's going to be disastrous at the polls. And when you look at how those voters voted, whether they said their situation was worse or the same, those who said the same voted 2-1 for Joe Biden. Those who said worse voted 74 for 23 for Joe Biden. This, was all the rules that work in Trump's favor when he blows them up doesn't mitigate the need to use some common sense in your campaign and understand where the voters are. but he's just not a controllable or malleable candidate. Most of us as consultants would look and say to somebody, hey, you think you built the greatest economy on earth, but Americans don't believe that anymore. Stop saying it. And most of them would listen. That's not the case here. So, and I think whether those things work going forward to Democrats' advantage, I think we've often done well with middle and working class voters, particularly when Republicans want tax cuts at the high end, which most voters don't like, giving tax cuts to the wealthy and corporations. So, I think there were other dynamics at work here that contributed. And one last point that we haven't touched on, but the plurality of voters made up their mind, they said, in the exit polls in the month of September. And I really wonder how much Trump's demeanor and performance at that first debate just put the nail in the coffin for a lot of middle of the road voters for him who just said, I cannot take this guy's behavior. If my kids acted like this, I ground them for 3 weeks. And I think they decided to ground Donald Trump after that.
Yeah, Todd, I saw you raised your hand, but I'm going to ask you a question. If you can weave it in, that's great. Because you mentioned something that I think is really interesting. I hope the people watching think so too. But since I'm the moderator, right? And that is, you talked about intensity and the intensity of these rural voters and their commitment to and attachment to Donald Trump. And it's a two-part question, and it starts with this. I was always struck by the fact that ever since he got there, he seemed more interested. I'm sorry. Okay, he seemed more interested in appealing to his base than he was ever interested in getting new people into his coalition. And it doesn't seem like that's a very good way to win a re-election campaign. So my question is, as he went further and further into the base, it seemed like he got stronger and stronger among the base, but it was a small group and it wasn't growing. So it's a two-part question. Number one, could any other Republican in the future match that intensity among that group of people and turn them out the way he did? A. And B, do you believe that the Democrats matched that intensity on the other side with an intensity to get rid of Donald Trump that was equal to or greater? And I want to ask Jonathan to comment on that as well, because Jonathan, you interviewed a lot of these folks, and obviously you'll have a perspective as well. Todd?
And I'll answer the second one first. If you subscribe to the applicability of loss aversion theory to voter behavior, the answer would be no. That people who are voting in order to gain something that they don't already have are not ever going to be as motivated as those voters who are rightly or wrongly perceived that they are voting to protect something that is at risk. If that theory holds true, it would certainly explain why, no matter how motivated people were to either get rid of Trump, no matter how motivated the progressive base was to vote in favor of the kind of country that they wanted, it was never going to be as motivating as those who were voting to protect something that they already have. As far as the coalition Trump was able to put together, I would love to be able to say yes, that other Republicans can match that coalition, but I'm not sure that that's the case. At least insofar as if you look at those candidates who ran in 2016, I don't think that any of them, and I worked very proudly for Marco Rubio, but I don't think we would have been able to build the kind of white working class coalition that Trump did, and certainly not have we certainly would not have had the intensity that Trump has.
Okay, Jonathan, and then Betsy. I thought you had your hand raised. Jonathan, do you have?
Yeah, I think Trump himself is going to be the one that can keep this going. And look, how much can it be transferred? He couldn't transfer it in the midterms the same way that he couldn't, that Barack Obama couldn't transfer his appeal in 2010 or 2014 or 2016. And if we're being candid, he couldn't transfer it in Florida, last week either. So I think that these presidents have a unique hold on their voters because they're unique figures. And I'm just skeptical that from himself can pass it on. There's a fascinating conversation going on now in the White House because a lot of Republicans are trying to incentivize good behavior with Trump now by saying that you can get a reward later if you're good now. And the reward later, of course, is you can run again for president in 24 if you don't totally fuck this up now and botch the transition. How much of that is true? How much of that is like just trying to keep him from going nuclear in the next couple of weeks? How interested is he in running? I will say this: if he doesn't run in 2024, his kids are going to be interested in running for either president or something. I mean, they're not going away. I think Democrats and moderate Republicans have deluded themselves to think that, like, by defeating him, that somehow you're going to end. Like, they are in this deal for the long run, and they're going to be a huge part of the party.
Whether he runs again in 2024 or not, my guess is he will keep the door open for a very, very, very long time, and which will make it very difficult, if not impossible, for any other Republican to start putting a,
like Marco Rubio, for example.
Like, hypothetically speaking, Marco or anyone. It makes it very hard to do.
The comparison that I've used is like the 2009 to 2011 Sarah Palin experience. If you guys can think back a decade, there was so much hype around Sarah Palin after 08. What's she gonna do? Remember, she quit the governorship in the summer of 09. Don't forget that. What's she gonna do? Is she gonna run? Is she going to Iowa? She's endorsing in the South Carolina gov race. She's a kingmaker. She made Nikki Haley governor. I mean, there was a period there where she was a big deal in the party, and it was all with an eye on, will she run in 2012? And I think we're about to go through the same experience, an order of magnitude bigger, with the former president and the most famous person in the world. Is he going to run again in 24? And of course, he's the consummate showman. Why would he ever say, nah, you know what? I'm good. I'm going to go play golf in Florida. Come on. Of course he's going to, drag it along, right? Of course he is.
I think one of the things that I'm most fascinated to watch, given that dynamic, which I totally agree with, is how does Fox cover him post White House? If they continue covering him the way that they have, you virtually ensure that no other Republican can, get any lift. So that'll be something I have.
Totally agree.
Okay.
Well, speaking of Fox, too, in this two different realities that we seem to be living in America, and it goes to the point of sort of where we are divided. I mean, one of the big things that jumped out to me on the exit poll very early in the night, which made me think, okay, this is going to be a closer election than maybe we thought, was the question about the handling of the coronavirus. And there was a very simple question on the exit poll, what is your opinion on U.S. efforts thus far to contain the coronavirus? How do you think it's going? And it's 50% of the people in this country think that efforts to contain the coronavirus are going well. This is at a time when, you look at the map, it's, everywhere. And 50% of this country thinks that efforts to contain it are going well. It's living in two different realities.
Doug, you're right with us in this reality right now.
One of the things that I remember from, that, people really were skeptical of Joe Biden being good at is raising money. And you saw that during the primary. He got outlapped in terms of raising money by people like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, everybody basically, right? And you can go back to his race in 2008. He had a hard time raising money, right? So one of the big question marks hovering over the Biden campaign was whether or not they were going to be able to raise money. And I think and that actually ended up being when you step back and look at this election, he was able to compete extremely well, and by the end of the race was far outraising the Trump Republican apparatus. And if you look at, if you look at the last month of the campaign, or the first half of October, Biden raised 130 million versus 43 million for Donald Trump. And so, and I think the other point is how that money was managed or mismanaged in the case of the Trump campaign. And by the end, they were barely able to compete. I mean, they were not competing on the airwaves in a lot of these states that became battlegrounds. Interesting enough, to your point, Jonathan, we can argue how important television advertising means. I think it means a lot, but obviously that's because I'm a media consultant.
Totally.
But if you look at the two states that ended up being very close and are still close, North Carolina and Georgia,
Yeah.
The Trump campaign actually outspent Biden in North Carolina pretty substantially, almost by $20-30 million. And in Georgia, it was substantial. It was 20 million. So those two places, if you're, from a question as to why didn't we do better in North Carolina, I don't know what the numbers were for Cunningham and Cooper, but at the presidential level, there was, at least on advertising, there looked like to be a pretty big disparity between the two campaigns. But I just would go back to the point of the whole issue, and small dollar donors by the end, Biden was doing exceptionally well with. But the whole ability of the Biden campaign to raise money, which was something that there was already deep skepticism about at the end, I think was a huge component to him winning and being able to spread the field.
We got to talk about this issue of small dollar donors, because obviously it gives these Democrats endless money in competitive states to run TV ads and to fund their campaigns. But do you guys think that at some point it's counterproductive in a place like South Carolina or Kentucky or Maine, where you've got an element of rural conservatism? Is it counterproductive to have out-of-state liberal money flooding those states? Can that become a bigger news story than the money itself helps the Democrat, I guess is my question.
I think that there will be many studies and people will be spending a lot of time looking at the just the avalanche of dollars that were spent, not just in the presidential race, but in the Senate race there, and in some of these House races where there were a handful of Republican candidates that raised, that the guy ran against AOC raised like $10 million.
Yeah,
I mean, there's zero chance for this guy to win. Teresa Greenfield in Iowa, the Iowa Senate race between both sides ended up being, it was like $240 million in the state of Iowa. It's insane. And Greenfield.
Well, so Todd, let me ask you a question. In a race like that, because you were doing that race, what happens? I mean, you guys have $150 million in Iowa, which is enough to run a presidential campaign in one state. What do you do with all the money? You can't buy that much television. You can't spend that much money, right?
No, you can't. We raised a bunch of money. The Ernst campaign that came in at the very end, and I called our buyer, and they were only able to spend a fraction of what we wanted to spend. I don't think that. It's very easy to say in retrospect that the Democrats didn't get their money's worth in Iowa, but I don't think it's quite that simple. But just the sheer volume of spending this cycle, and I say this as a media consultant, but it truly was obscene.
Yeah, to Todd's point,
media consultants, by the way, media consultants don't usually say that. I'll just point that out for the
Well,
record. Doug, go ahead, and then I have a question
we don't
for
make
Joel.
any money when you're not able to spend it, Steve.
I know.
I mean,
Doug.
Steve, Jamie Harrison, his campaign was running, by the end, was running 5,000 points of television in a market each week. Now, for 1,400 points a week is generally considered a lot. 1,600, 2,000's a lot, right? They were running 5,000 points a week in one market. They were trafficking in. They had 5 or 6 different ads that they were running. And Lindsey Graham was also, Lindsey Graham was no, he didn't roll over either in terms of, he raised a ton of money as well. And he was running, they had so many different creatives going on, you could barely keep track of them. But that's an incredible amount of television to run, just in that market.
Yeah.
The Greenfield campaign in Iowa, at one point, they had a spot on about fixing potholes. And I remember thinking, like, my God, they've run out of things to say. They have so much money.
But guys, here's the thing. As we go into the Georgia runoffs in January that are going to decide control of the Senate, and we know what's going to happen. Every Democratic donor in America will go to Act Blue and give $25, $30 to the Democratic candidates. At some point, though, is that actually helping the candidates to have $1 zillion, or is that letting David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler say, they're trying to do it again? Coastal liberals trying to buy our state and impose Chuck Schumer as the Senate leader, and they're flooding our state with money. At some point, does the money coming in help less than it does, but empower the message of the other side?
Well, I would just say, and I'm going to go to Joel in a second. I would just say that's a problem most campaigns would take. We have too much money, so we have to deal with this argument. And by the way,
I know
they're going to make the argument anyway.
No, but that's exactly. They're going to make that argument anyway.
Okay.
So Joel, let me ask you a question.
All right.
Let me ask you a question, Joel, because you talked about how the middle is what wins presidential campaigns. And there's about to be, and there has been for a long time in our party, a debate about whether the middle really does and whether we should be chasing the elusive white non-college educated voter. And to my way of thinking, that may be the wrong way to think about it, because it used to be that the white middle class voter didn't have an interest any different from the African American or black voter, the Hispanic voter, the Latino voter, because it was about trying to improve their lot in life versus people who had a lot. Do you think A, it's possible, and B, it's likely that the Democratic Party will find messaging that will appeal equally to the white non-college educated male and the black or Latina voter who is progressive and younger? Is that possible?
Well, I think it's possible, and I think we do it more often and a little better than the Republican Party does in terms of getting to voters who aren't part of your base. We have been fairly successful as a party, winning in places that people didn't expect us to win. Republicans have as well. But, you've got to put together the right coalition in each race, and it's going to be determined race by race. There's a reason why people campaign in the cities and the suburbs more than rural areas most of the time. As Willie Sutton said, when they asked him, Willie, why'd you rob so many banks? And he said, he had robbed 27 banks. He said, that's where the money is. Well, it's not because that's where the money is, but you got to campaign where the votes are. And if you can create a path to winning in a state or carry a state like North Carolina, let's say, by winning the urban and the suburban and the ex-urban areas as a Democrat, then don't spend your time and effort disproportionately going to the rural areas. I think showing up matters. I think you got to campaign there a little bit, but every state is going to be different, and you've got to find out the right combination of voting blocks that are going to get you to 50% +1 to win the vote. And I don't think you should be married in any election to any one theory about what has happened before, because the electorate is different in each race and in each cycle, not dramatically, but what they're thinking about. And, presidential elections, you guys have probably all heard me say this, but I always say they're about big things, not small things. They're about the future, not the past, and they're about their lives, not your life. And that holds true in most elections. And whether you're talking to any group of voters. If you can connect on those things, you're going to do well. If you fail to, you're going to lose ground. I mean, Donald Trump was out of touch on the #1 issue. As president of the United States, the biggest crisis we faced was the pandemic. And he kept talking about having to rebuild the economy. And a majority of Americans thought it was more important to get the virus under control than it was to focus on the economy. I mean, you just have to be in touch with where they are in their lives and what they're thinking about for their future and their family's future. And I think there are some states where we can do better with rural voters. But at the end of the day, every one of us on this call, on this session here, would say you have to develop the calculus, whatever it takes, to win those elections. And if it involves reaching out to more rural voters in Iowa and they failed, I think Joni Ernst was less vulnerable than a lot of people thought from the beginning, then that's on you. You have to figure out what the right calculus is and what the right model is. And it's not like there's only one path to victory in any election, but you got to narrow your options so you can focus and spend your resources smartly and strategically.
Doug, did you have your hand up, or is that just on your chin?
It's just on my chin, but I agree with what Joel said. I mean, look, I think you've got to, the thing that, Nancy Pelosi, I think, is so masterful at is telling her advice to all of her caucus is you got to run the race that's going to win the race in your district, right? People like to give Nancy Pelosi, I think she's getting a lot of, I think, criticism for this election, but she always gives her candidates a lot of space to run their races. And I think that's really what the Democratic caucus has to recognize, that in order for us to win some districts in Georgia, in order for us to win some districts in Virginia, or start to move into some of the more southern, potentially rural districts, we're going to have to run candidates that you can't run in New York, right? Or run in California. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's how you grow a strong party. I think Republicans probably should learn a lesson like that in other parts of the country where they aren't faring too well, whether it's the suburbs or in urban areas. So I think keeping a closed mind on, the types of, on sort of what is the right ideology for the party. Right. Look, I think the party is about a brand, and our brand needs, and Democrats need to work on our brand. Republicans need to work on their brand. Right. But I think we've got to run candidates who can do well everywhere. And if that means that you run certain folks who have different views on issues that might be the majority view within the party, well, ultimately, to me, as a strategist, it's about winning races so that you can have people in Congress making decisions about policies that matter. It's not necessarily about finding that person who's going to adhere to whatever the Democratic ethos is on all of these different issues. We need to find good candidates. And we did that in 18, just these were really tough places to win in 20.
Can I pick up on that?
Joel, I thought I saw your, Betsy.
I just wanted to pick up on that and maybe ask Doug too. I mean, we've heard now sort of, the Democratic Party over the Thanksgiving table, right? With Abigail Spanberger coming out and, winning a very tight race in Virginia, much more moderate, and basically saying, the defund the police messaging, that, hurts candidates like her. And so there seems to be this little bit of the back and forth now within the party. You're saying that people just have to get the message that they have to run in their own districts, right?
Well, look, obviously, like I said, I think there's a brand that the Democratic Party needs to work on, and it needs to be much more oriented around working folks, Black and white and Latino, and it's got to be about helping working folks. I think where Trump made gains over the last 5-6 years is reorienting the Republican Party around working folks. And everyone thinks when people say working folks, they mean blue collar folks, blue collar white people. That's not what I'm saying. Working folks are black people work in blue collar jobs as well. Right. So, but I do think that you can't, I think I get what the moderate wing of the party is saying, but you also can't expect AOC or some of these other folks running in very Democratic precincts to take on what you believe is the right message. So all I'm saying is you have to find these candidates who are the perfect fits for their districts. And ultimately there needs to be an umbrella brand that everyone can sort of fall under. And if in some places you're going to be saying certain different things to win, then that makes sense. But I think voters need to know what the Democratic Party stands for. And right now under Biden, I think Biden has done a pretty good job of sort of, making, pushing that message through. I think with Republicans, it's always been a little bit easier. It's low taxes, no regulation, strong on defense. And Democrats have a harder time communicating that. But, I do think that, look, this tug of war is going to happen within the party. I think it's actually healthy and natural and part of what happens after an election. But at the end of the day, I don't know how a blue dog can tell AOC and the folks in more liberal districts to be able to not say certain things that people in their district want to hear. And then how AOC can turn around and tell people in moderate districts, don't talk about, you need to talk about Medicare for all and defund the police. People got to have respect for each other's districts and constituents.
Yeah. Right, but that doesn't quiet the $9 gajillion that someone from Todd's side, right, is going to come drop on television ads in a moderate Dem district, right?
Todd wouldn't do that, though, Betsy. Todd would not do that. Joel, I'm going to let you pick it up and close the comment part. We've got questions from the audience that we're going to try to get to as many as we can. So, Joel, last comment.
Great. Yeah, and I'll be quick. I want to amend the last thing I said. Here's where it's important to talk to rural voters, and it's the biggest failure we had this cycle. It's why we didn't pick up a single state legislative house in this cycle, and we did in 2018. We have got to compete everywhere. We've got to start electing people at the school board level and up so that we can reach into those communities who feel like this party hasn't talked to them and hasn't cared about them. Because if we don't win those seats back, then we're going to have, in this world of technology, both parties have it, the extreme gerrymandering that takes place where we've got basically politicians can pick their voters instead of the other way around because of the manipulation of these maps. And we have to get our hands on that in more places to keep it more at least balanced or even handed when we can, or we're going to fall behind in too many states and be consigned more permanently to a minority party in those states.
Okay, so thanks everybody. I'm going to just ask a few questions that I'm getting prompted on the comment section over here, and if I get to your question, that's great, and if I don't, I apologize. There are many. You made the observation, Jonathan. I'm going to just throw this out for anybody who wants to comment on it. That Joe Biden was the man for the moment, and I think you actually asked the question of whether or not it would have been possible for anybody else to win this thing besides Joe Biden. And I guess I'd like to ask you and the panel, do you think it would be possible? If it's a referendum on Donald Trump, theoretically, anybody who's standing against him would win. On the other hand, that's sort of what it was in 2016. So the question is, if Bernie Sanders had run and been nominated, would he have won? Hillary Clinton, anybody else? Anybody that wants to take a shot at that one, go ahead.
I mean, I think with Bernie, he would have had a hard time replicating the numbers in the suburbs, especially around Philly and around Milwaukee, that Biden got. Nothing of Detroit. I mean, could he have done better with Hispanics and made up for it? Potentially. But I don't know if he would have done better in the rural area. And I think he would have had a real challenge around Detroit, Milwaukee, and Philly, getting the kind of numbers that Biden did. And I think other candidates would have had a similar challenge. I kind of wonder about guys. This is like Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg, who would have been acceptable in the suburbs, but could they have juiced the sort of base turnout, and would they have done any better in the rural areas than Biden? I don't know, man. I look at the 2016 map in these states, and I look at the 2020 map in these states. To me, the story is what didn't change. My God, there's so much similarities, right? I mean, look at Iowa. Biden didn't do that much better in all these eastern Iowa counties along the Mississippi River, Steve, that you know so well, that they're Catholic communities. Those are like shot in a beer, Knights of Columbus type communities in Dubuque and Davenport. And Joe Biden is like built in a lab for those voters, and he didn't do any better than Hillary. So I just don't think there's that much slack in the map except at the margins. And it was at the margins where he did better than Hillary in the suburbs. And that's where he got his win, so.
Also, what if we would have gotten a Bernie, then would we have gotten a Mike Bloomberg as a third party?
Great point. It's a good point.
And
Yeah.
we certainly know that that was a
Lynn-
significant component when we were looking at some of these tight states in 2016 with the third party vote really impacting and hurting Hillary.
Good point, Bev.
Our sponsor, Lynn, I think may have a question or a comment.
Rights of a primogenitor. I just wanted to ask the group, considering actually just for a moment to divert from the candidates to the process, because so many of you had ringside seats. I mean, we were treated for several weeks, months of apocalyptic visions of a complete meltdown of our voting system. Whether it was going to be machinery breakdown, no poll workers, suppression of the vote, so between snafus, scoundrels, and spies, we were supposed to have a completely dysfunctional voting system, and yet it seemed to hold up. So maybe a little outside your lanes of expertise, but I'd just be interested in some of your insights of sort of the catastrophe that didn't happen.
It's a great point, Lynn. For all the hype about the voting process, this has worked pretty well. I mean, Arizona and Georgia, as you guys know, typically have a longer count because there are a handful of communities there that take longer to count ballots, especially in Arizona. This happened in 2018 because Arizona is a heavy mail-in ballot state. That's what they do in Arizona. And Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, as we know, took a few days just because they wouldn't let their counties count the ballots as they came in, and they wanted to start counting them on election day. So of course it was going to take longer for the count. But besides that, which was fairly predictable, I think it's been pretty smooth,
Anybody else want to comment on that?
Well, I'll just jump in and defend the television networks, because I do think that they laid some groundwork, certainly in letting voters know ahead of time, hey, this may not be decided on election night. And we're very thorough and transparent in votes that were coming in, how they were coming in, what the components of, mail-in votes were. And really, as we all sort of followed along, right, for the last, 3 or 4 days after the election as well, really, being transparent with viewers as to how this process was playing out.
I think I'm also, Betsy, ready to add poll workers to the healthcare workers, the postal service workers, and the people that kept us afloat since March.
So
secretaries of state of either party stepping up.
Well, and becoming vilified.
Right.
Taking incoming fire, for actually following the law, right?
Right, for civil service jobs. Thanks.
Joel Benenson, you had your hand up.
Yeah, quick comment. I think that the Republican Party has to come to a point where they stop perpetrating the notion that there is rampant voter fraud in this country. It hurt them in this election. They paid a price for it in various places. You ask people in polls whether they've heard of any cases or instances of voter fraud in their communities, in their local and state elections, and overwhelmingly people say no, because there hasn't been any. And it's to the detriment of the democracy. Both parties in this country need to want people to vote, and we shouldn't try to destabilize it when you have absolutely no foundation for making such a case. And I'm not, Todd, I know you're the Republican on the call and in this session today. This isn't about Todd. It's not about any Republican in particular. The president played that hand, and frankly, it bit him in the butt. His voters decided not to vote by mail.
I guess I'll do 2 things. One point that has already been mentioned. It was a huge strategic problem for Republicans that all of a sudden mail-in voting was demonized. I mean, we saw this in races all over the country. To a degree, more so than I ever have on any previous election, I was checking the long-term weather forecast heading into election day because, we put all of our eggs in that basket.
Yeah.
You know, you have an ice storm or something in Iowa and suddenly your people can't turn out. It's a big problem. And you know, as far as accusations of fraud, my view is if they exist, let's see them. If they are problematic, let's investigate them. If they're illegal, let's take it to the courts. But if not, then let's move on. You know, it's time to. I think Christie said, you know, let's see the evidence.
Yeah, and that message actually undermines. I mean, that message also undermines the Republicans who won. You know, because you can't have a system where there was rampant fraud, and somehow that didn't affect Republicans who won. So it's like this idea that Democrats created this elaborate conspiracy where fraud was rampant to help elect Joe Biden, but we couldn't figure out how to apply it to win House seats and Senate races, right? I mean, it's absurd.
The dead voter voted for Biden and also for Joni Ernst, right?
Yeah, I made this point to a friend of mine just yesterday. I said, explain to me how the fraud works where ballots are being manipulated to hurt Trump, but to like have massive gains in state legislative races. And to
can you tweet that? Tweet that shit, dude. Seriously.
I'm happy to tweet it.
See if you got the stones to do it, man. I want to see it. Let's do it.
Let's
put it up now.
See what kind of stuff happens.
Live.
See what kind of stuff happens when NYU panels come together. Usually, by
I miss
the way,
you guys. I wish we were all together doing this, man. This sucks.
For those of you who are watching remotely, this usually happens in Italy or in Greece somewhere, often over dinner and drinks, and we get a lot of real truth in those settings and a lot of great friendships. We're just about out of time. I see that we had the Chairman Steele, join us, and Karen Finney, one of our esteemed colleagues. If they had anything they wanted to add or ask, we can take that. Otherwise, we'll give everybody a minute back in advance of the next panel, which is starting in about 6 minutes, Lynn, is that right? Karen or Michael, Steele, did you guys have anything you wanted to toss in? Karen's muted.
I'm glad we won. Yay, Black women. Yay, first Black woman vice president. History making, new chapter in the history of Black women in America. She's going to enter the White House that was built by slaves as the vice president of the United States of America.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing. Everybody, thank you for your time and thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it.